You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to Tea Break Time Travel, where every month we look at a different archaeological object and take you on a journey into their past. Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Tea Break Time Travel. I'm your host, Matilda Ziebrecht, and today I'm savouring a strawberry tea. Very seasonally appropriate, at least here we're nearly out of the strawberry season. And joining me on my tea break today is archaeologist Femke Reidsma. And are you also drinking a seasonally appropriate tea, or have you gone the more traditional route?
I don't know about that, but I'm drinking an iced matcha.
Oh,
I love that in the summer.
Okay, that sounds very exotic. I admit, I've tried a matcha latte once, and I just couldn't.
You need to source this is going to sound extremely pretentious. You need to source really high quality matcha, otherwise it just tastes like chalk, which is awful. Yeah. Okay. But once you do, I can highly recommend. It's a good coffee alternative that doesn't give you the jitters.
Oh, well, that's because it was to be fair, now I'm thinking about it, the only time I've tried it, I think, was when we were having a long drive and we stopped at a, gas station thing.
No.
Not the matcha latte, because I didn't want to have a coffee. And I thought, that sounds nice. Everyone always goes on and on about how nice matcha is. And then it was disgusting, but that probably explains why.
I mean, that happened to me a few times before I found the nice stuff.
Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, no. Oh, dear. Does that mean I have to go shopping for some nice matcha tea? What a shame.
I can share the website that I order it from now.
And is it like a powder thing that you add, or is it like a tea? So
it is ground green tea leaves.
Okay.
That I think are grown in the shades in Japan, like very specific conditions. And then you mix it in with the right temperature water. It's very sensitive.
Okay.
And then you whisk it with one of those like bamboo whisks.
The little things.
So it becomes a bit frothy.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. It's a fun process also.
Well, that's the nice thing, right? And that's why I use loose tea pretty much all the time now, because it's just such a nice little kind of, ritual. You're allowed to use the word ritual as an archaeologist. It's a nice little morning ritual to just have the tea and set it up and do the kettle.
Start your day.
So I can imagine. Yeah, exactly. Good to know. Okay, well, there you go. We've learned something new already, because I had no idea about what matcha was supposed to taste like or what it really was. But even though we both love tea, we are not here to talk about tea. We're here to talk about your speciality, shall we say, in archaeology, which we'll get to in a moment. But first of all, I always like to ask my guests how they first became involved with archaeology, because so far we have had no two similar answers. Everyone has a very different path. So I think it's nice to show the diversity. So what was your entrance into the field of archaeology?
So I think my journey with archaeology started when I was quite young. So I always knew I wanted to be a scientist because I wanted to understand the world around me. And then I remember going on holiday with my parents to France as a kid, and we visited an archaeology museum, and I loved it. And then in the area surrounding the museum, there was an ongoing excavation of some Roman stuff. And then I just realized, wait, these people do this for a living? If this is a thing you can do, then that's what I want to become when I grow up. So then in the years following that, I looked into what archaeology was, and I got super excited because it mixes the humanities and the natural sciences. And I always had an interest in both, and I kind of didn't want to choose. And then I thought that I would get into late prehistory because that seemed super fun, and that's what I saw most at museums. And then as soon as I arrived at university, I absolutely fell in love with human evolution. So that's the route I took, and the rest is history, or rather prehistory. Yeah.
And see, if you're listening in and you also immediately thought of that horrible joke, then you are in the right place.
Yeah, only downhill from here in terms of puns.
Exactly. But and I find that really fascinating indeed, that you mentioned already that archaeology is the mix between kind of humanities and natural sciences, because I feel like most people don't really think of it like that. They think of it more as kind of an extension of history. But so you were also always interested in the scientific aspect from the start, or did you kind of try to find the science, if that makes sense?
So I was interested as a kid. I was interested in biology and physics and that sort of stuff. But yeah, it took me a bit of diving into archaeology to find where I could satisfy that interest, so to say. But luckily, there's lots of scientific techniques that are being used, and those disciplines like biology and geology also play an important role, especially in human evolution studies.
Yeah. And I think it depends so much as well on which, for example, when you're starting out and you're studying like which uni you go to, because I was at Aberdeen Uni for my undergrad, and there the archaeology courses and the archaeology department was in with the geology department, for example. Like that's how they classified them, as like the geosciences. Whereas I feel like in a lot of other ones, they're with, like in Groningen, they're with the humanities department, you know, so it's
and then in Leiden, we're a separate faculty where there's a bit of an identity crisis because
incredible.
I mean, it is. It's amazing. I think it's also the only archaeology faculty in Europe, something like that.
I think so too, yeah.
But so we have more theoretical archaeologists, we have the sort of hardcore sciences part, and basically everything in between, which is really nice.
Yeah, and I love as well, because I also, for those listening in, I met Femke at Leiden University, indeed. That is how I got to know of her research. And I love that, indeed, you could sort of sit down in the cafeteria and then have a chat with people who were doing the same stuff as you, but they were doing completely different stuff. So, you know, everyone was doing their master's thesis, but everyone was doing it in a completely different topic. Like one person was doing teeth dating techniques, and I was doing amber bead making, and Femke's, burning things. So it was a very interesting mixture of.
Yeah, I find that super inspiring because, you get to interact with people who do something that is way outside your specific specialization.
Yeah, definitely. And it also just proves the whole thing that when people ask, oh, you're an archaeologist, so where do you like digging? And you're going, it's not all about digging.
I spend lots of time in labs, which is also fun, but sometimes you have to get outside.
Yeah, true. I do that with my experimental archaeology, so then I get both without needing to dig a hole. I must admit, I've spoken on this before about this. I think probably people listening will hate me because I'm not I like field work in its place occasionally in the sun on a nice cool day.
Yeah, that's the benefit of academic field work. Mostly, yes. I guess you also went to the Arctic, but we tend to do this in the summer when the weather is nicer.
It's nicer, yeah. But anyway, good. Okay. So sorry, I got a bit carried away there. I think that it's very important to highlight that archaeology has so many different facets and different topics within it. And we will talk about this more in the third section as well. But of course, this is a time travel tea break. So if you could travel back anywhere in time, where would you go and why?
So this is always a bit of a difficult question for me because human evolution covers such a vast time span. But I'm currently working on a paper where we explore different hypotheses about the earliest active use of fire. So I think right now I would want to travel back about 1.5 million years ago to see how Homo erectus might have interacted with fire. I think that would be really fun.
Yeah. Oh, and well, hang on. I'll save that. We'll talk about that again in a minute, but, because I think that relates a lot to some of the discussion points that I have for section 2. But thank you very much for joining me on this tea break today. And we are going to do some time traveling indeed. Before we sort of talk a little bit more about Femke's specialization, we're journeying back not quite that far. We're going back around 50,000 years. Night is falling, the sound of cicadas fills the air, accompanied by the occasional rumble and roar of various wild animals in the distance. Nearby, there's a group of figures huddled around a spot on the ground. It's unsure exactly what kind of figures they are, crouching low to watch one of the group in his activities. We creep lower to see what's happening and catch sight of a spark leaping from a piece of flint that is struck down with a loud ringing ping. Another strike, another spark, a grunt of frustration from the individual who adjusts the small bundle of dry grass piled carefully below his hands. A few more strikes, and suddenly a spark hits true, and a tiny plume of smoke rises into the air. The group makes noises of excited encouragement as the finger lifts the smoking bundle of grass and caresses it in his hands, blowing it until a bright orange flame flickers into life, piercing the ever-darkening sky. So today we are looking at fire, which is a bit of a contentious one for this podcast because technically I suppose it's not really an artifact, but that is something that we will also be discussing further in the next section. So we will get to that soon. But first, let's have a look, as always, at the most asked questions on the internet, courtesy of Google search. And this was particularly difficult this time because trying to put in fire, what fire, where fire, our fire into Google search, comes up with very random results that are completely unrelated to this podcast. But I thought that these might be slightly relevant, so maybe you can still help with these. So the first question, was what is fire? Which I guess, fair enough. What actually is fire?
Yeah, I think that's a good question to start with. So fire is a chemical reaction between heat, an organic fuel, and oxygen. It requires an input of sufficient heat to reach the ignition temperature of the fuel. And once ignited, the organic components of the fuel are transformed into carbon-rich char. So think of charcoal that you put on your barbecue. And during this process, CO2 and other gases are released. And when enough oxygen is available, the char and those gases will oxidize, creating the characteristic glowing embers and the flames. Yeah, so that's what fire is.
So the sort of color that you see is basically the chemicals, the thing one turning into thing two kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, nice, excellent, perfect. And then the next question kind of relates to this because both of the next questions relate to this actually, and they are, why is fire blue and what fire is the hottest? And because indeed you have, depending on the heat of the fire, it seems to change color all the time. So what's the deal with that, basically?
Yeah, exactly. So the main thing relating to fire color is indeed temperature, which then relates to the completeness of the combustion process and the efficiency of the fuel. And as people might know, there's different fire colors. With increasing temperature, you have red, orange, yellow, white, and blue. But the color also relates to the composition of the fuel. So, for example, if you add some copper into the process, then you get green flames. So by adding different chemicals, you can also create different colors. And this is what happens in fireworks, for example.
Oh, I see.
So temperature and different chemicals.
Okay, yeah. Which, I mean, and that's also all very scientific, but I guess
there's no way around it.
Yeah. But indeed, it's nice that almost the different colours are a nice visual aid as well, I suppose, for people in the past, for example, who would have needed fire to be able to tell how hot something.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, they didn't put a temperature label on it, but I think they knew that if we want to do this task, we need the fire to look like this. Mm-hmm. And then they knew how to achieve that.
Yeah, because it's so for fire, you basically need then organic component, oxygen, heat, I assume, of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's called the fire triangle. So those are the three essential components.
Okay, perfect. And how would the heat have been created? Because I mean, so I had in the time travel, you had sort of a piece of flint, for example. I've also heard of like the drills being, is that something that could have been used? This is what I see on lots of YouTube videos, but I'm not sure myself.
So if you want to use flint, you also need a piece of pyrite or marcasite, which is an iron oxide that creates the spark. So you strike that material with the flint, and then you kind of detach really small pieces. And in the sort of the heat that is involved in the strike, you produce sparks that then you need to aim at the tinder to actually get that to ignite, which is more difficult than you think.
Yeah.
And if you want to go a different route, then there's fire drills, which is indeed a piece of wood that you try and drill into as fast as possible into a wooden board, sort of a base board, where you then create, with the friction, you create sort of a bit of a small ember that you then put on your tinder material.
Ah, I see. So you've already kind of created a little bit of burning.
Yeah, so there's increasing complexity in the type of, you have a fire drill, you have a fire bow, and there's some other things. Fire production is not necessarily my specialization, so I'm sure there's more tools out there that you could use that are used in bushcraft or used by extent hunter-gatherers. But yeah, this is sort of the basic options.
Yeah, which is just so fascinating because indeed it's one of those things that then, yes, you need the triangle, what was it? Oxygen, organic matter, heat. But then to create the heat, you also need the perfect tools or the perfect combination. And I imagine when things are wet, it also doesn't really work. So
so the benefit of using flint and pyrite is that at least your tools don't get so wet. You can easily dry them because the moisture doesn't go into the tools, right? But if you use wood, then you're in some trouble.
And wood, I mean, you've literally just told me that this isn't your area of specialization, so I apologize if you don't get the answer to this one.
No worries.
But would the pyrite, for example, I mean, is that commonly found everywhere, or would there have then been locations where it was just not environmentally possible to make fire? Or, do we know about that?
I know that there's particular areas where it's found in abundance, and then there's other areas where it's more scarce. So people would have had to look for the material and then assess the quality. So it might have been more difficult to produce fire in certain areas. But what you can also do, if you have the fire, either created by production or because you took it from a natural source, if you make sure that you keep it going, you can transport those little embers and then just start a new fire in a different location.
I've heard about this because wasn't this something with Ötzi, the Iceman that was found in Austria or something? But
he also had a fire starting kit on him.
Oh, okay. But because, I mean, the embers, but how, again, I'm asking you these random questions, but because surely, I'm just thinking of it, I mean, nearly all material that they would have used back then, unless they've made like a stone or I guess a pottery thing to carry them in, but surely the embers would just burn through anything that they carry it in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't fully understand how this would have worked either, but I mean, there are hunter-gatherers who do this, and there are even groups that knew how to produce fire that then lost the ability to do that, but still are using fire.
Okay, interesting. Oh, see, that's where I think that's where I need to go back in time to just see what the first people worked out how to do that. They were like, let's just take this with us. Oh, it burns through that. Oh, what about this? Oh, it burns through that as well. Okay, well, this works. Okay, well,
maybe they just needed to time it right. This is wrap it up in lots of organic materials and then
run.
But by the time it starts to burn through your pouch, this is where you have to set up camp.
Yeah, there you go. Once the fire starts, then you can stop. The
fire dictates where you go.
It has even more agency than we think in dictating the lives of people. So we're getting into section 2 territory now. So I think we'll have a very quick break, but we will be back soon. So welcome back, everybody. So we know a little bit more about fire itself, but Femke, as you are here as our fire human evolution expert, maybe you could tell us even more about it in relation to that. So when I was researching this to try and make the little time travel segment, I did find it very hard to discover exactly when the earliest evidence for fire actually is. So I think even in the original one, it sort of said 1.5 million years, but then we were chatting and you said, not so sure, because somewhere else said 50,000 years indeed, and that's what I put in. But so when is the earliest evidence that we have for fire use, or, what's the discussion around that? Because it sounds like quite a complicated topic.
Yeah, it is. And there is still a lot of discussion about the earliest use of fire and also about what that then looked like. So if you take a certain definition, then maybe it goes back in time to date X. But then if you take a different definition, it becomes younger or even much older. Oh. So the earliest association of fire traces with human behavior, so to say, those date to 1.5, 1.6 million years ago, and they're found in Africa at a few different sites. There's still a bit of discussion about whether that's natural fire, whether these hominins, so in this case, mostly Homo erectus, were actually using the fire, or maybe not. So it's important to make sure that the evidence you find is actually heated materials. Then you have to figure out if it's anthropogenic fire use or natural fire. So that makes the earliest evidence a bit complicated. Then when you go to slightly younger periods, but still super old, I guess, for every other type of archaeology, the evidence becomes a bit more easy to interpret and also a bit more widespread and a bit more solid. So in Europe, good evidence for fire use, like regular widespread fire use, goes back at least to 400,000 years ago. There is also some earlier stuff in Europe, but that is more contentious. And then fire production, which we talked about earlier, is very difficult to trace in the archaeological records. And the earliest evidence for that dates to around 50,000 years ago.
Okay, so we see the fire in the archaeological record at the 400,000 years ago, even before, but it's unsure whether they were actually creating it at that point.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's different earliest evidence for also in different regions.
Okay. But we know that, for example, 400,000 years ago, they were using the fire. What's the sort of, what are the signs that can tell us that?
So you trace fire in the archaeological record by looking for what we call fire proxies. So that's anything that's affected by heat left behind by the use of fire. If we're lucky, then that preserves in the shape of a hearth, which then makes it very easy to recognize and also to identify that it's human-made and used. If preservation is less favorable, then we have to work with scattered ash, charcoal, heated bones, some heated lithics, biomolecules in the soil. And then the puzzle becomes a bit more complicated because you have to put those things together and make sure, again, that they're actually heated and that they relate to human behavior.
Okay, and so what else could cause those, if it wasn't heated, what else could have happened there, kind of thing?
So there's certain soil processes that could also stain, for example, bones. So then they would look black, but they're not actually heated. And for other organic materials like plant material, humification, which is a part of a process in soil formation, which you want if you want to grow plants, that sort of thing, also creates the look of early charring, but then it's not actually heated. And there's oxidation processes in sediments that make it look red, which has to do with iron instead of heating. So there's quite a bit of processes that result in the same visual characteristics, but then if you take a more closer chemistry look at it, then you'll find that it's not actually heated.
And do you then find that there's quite a lot of evidence, shall we say, in inverted commas, from kind of previous years of research where they didn't maybe use these scientific methods that now have been disproven? Obviously you can't disprove anything in archaeology, but as in the evidence at least has been shown to not actually be evidence for fire because it looked like it, but it wasn't chemically viable. Does that make sense? Yes.
That's especially the case for material that was excavated in, let's say, the 50s and the 60s. Yeah, because those techniques, they were available but not as widely used. And some of that, especially the more contentious, very early sites, have been found to not actually involve heating. And a more famous, I guess, maybe only in my field, example is the site of Schöninge in Germany, where they also found those famous spears and a bunch of butchered animal remains, and also what originally was presumed hearth features. They were round, they were red, there was material sticking out of it. It looked like it had charcoal, and the original excavators sort of preserved them in the spot to wait for more elaborate techniques to become available to really check if they were heated. And then someone did about 10 years ago, and she actually found that they were not hearths. They were the formation of other soil processes like oxidation, iron content, and some humification of materials. And so there were some bones in there as well, and they were just not heated at all.
Oh, okay. So, that's so disappointing.
Yeah, because that would have been really cool to have something that old really be, and also something that really looked like a hearth. So even with those, you sometimes have to be careful.
Indeed, because a hearth is generally like a pit in the ground, or I mean, what's the sort of general identifying features, would you say? They
can also be a fireplace can be built on a flat surface. So then, in that case, you'll see a sort of a spherical signature in the sediment of reddened soil, And then there's a layer of char, which is the charred plant material that was in or on the surface of what the fire was built on. Then a layer of ash, which relates to either the fuel or burning of the topsoil. And then there might be some charcoal and stuff in there. Maybe there's some stones around it. Sometimes people indeed dug shallow pits or deeper pits that then are filled with heated material.
Which I guess is the same as you'd see on like a campsite nowadays. Like if people have kind of tidied away their fire. So I suppose it's one of those things that just hasn't really changed. You know, there's only so many ways to build a hearth, I suppose.
Yeah, and not to get too technical again, but if you think about fire as the application of heat energy, then there's different types to contain that heat and also different types to spread heat. And one type of fire is not necessarily more efficient, or I should say one type of campfire is not necessarily more efficient at radiating that heat than a different type. So that might actually indicate cultural choices rather than functional ones.
Interesting. So there's typologies, fire typologies.
Yeah.
Which relates a little bit to another question I had, because indeed, some people might be listening in and thinking, why are they talking about fire? I thought that this podcast was about archaeological objects and things in the past. But the reason that we are having this particular episode is because, as I say, I know Femke from Leiden, and we were having a chat about my podcast, and she was saying, well, fire's an object. And I was going, is it? She said, yes, of course it is. So I thought we could unpack that a little bit on here. And I thought, indeed, it's an interesting concept. I mean, what defines an archaeological artifact? So to you, fire is indeed an artifact.
Yeah, I think it's both it's definitely a chemical process, right? But I also think it's an artifact. And for the purpose of this question, I Googled the definition of an artifact. So according to
excellent. We love that.
Dictionary.com, which to be fair is not an archaeological source, but this is, I guess, the generally accepted definition of an artifact. Mm-hmm. It says, something made or given shape by a human being, such as a tool or a work of art. I like that they mentioned that. Uh-huh. Especially an object of archaeological interest. And then it also says anything man-made. Oh. And I think this already supports my argument that fire is an artifact, because it's not, like you said, it's not an object per se. Or at all.
Well, although you can carry it around with you, apparently.
Yeah,
so, you know.
That might be the definition of an object.
Yeah.
But it is definitely a tool that is used for lots of different things. And when it's actively used, it's shaped by humans. Mm-hmm. It's eventually also produced by humans. When it preserves as a recognizable feature, like a hearth, it can be classified in terms of typology, like other artifacts.
Exactly, as we were just saying. Yeah.
And then, as with other artifacts, we want to know how it was made and what it was used for. So I think that makes it an artifact.
Yeah, I mean, you've persuaded me. I think it's, and like you say, it's a tool, right, in a way. So sort of something. Although that does then... Oh, there's a couple of things. Okay, so maybe first of all, because you just mentioned it, so we've already talked quite a bit about how it was made, but how indeed would it have been used, do you think, by, for example, those earliest, I think you mentioned Homo erectus, I guess also Homo neanderthalis would have been using it, and then of course Homo sapiens. So how can we identify what it was used for, basically?
So yes, this is a great question, and also one that's still very hotly, not intended. Yeah.
Oh, they just
it's hotly debated. It's sparked debate. Yeah, there's endless puns. It's terrible. And my apologies to all listeners. And anyway,
they're loving it.
So, based on ethnographic studies and also modern use of fire, we know that it can be used for lots of different things, right? So it can be used for cooking. It can be used to provide light. It can be used to provide heat. It can be used to ward off insects or predators. It's used in ritualistic settings. It's used as a tool to shape and produce other materials. True. And most of those things also apply to the past. there's also sociological evidence studies that show that sitting around a campfire has a calming effect on people. So it lowers your blood pressure, and then it makes people more social. I have no idea how that works, but this is what those studies show.
What was that science?
And then not a sociologist. And then there's also, it's been suggested that it played a role in the development of language. Some of those functions are easier to identify in the archaeological record than others, because the development of language obviously does not leave physical traces.
No, not until history, and we assume that they were speaking, I guess, a lot earlier than they started writing things down. Yeah.
But some of these other things you might be able to directly trace. So step one is finding evidence for fire. And then from there, you would want to, if we go back to fire being the application, the fire use being the application of heat energy to a specific task, you'd want to know what the characteristics of that fire were, because cooking requires a different temperature than, let's say,
iron working.
Iron smelting.
You wouldn't want to cook your chicken at the temperature that you're melting an iron.
No, definitely not. There would be no chicken left. And then a fire that needs to provide light needs flames, whereas again, a cooking fire is more glowing embers. And then if you want to produce tar as an adhesive, then you need a reducing environment. So an environment that is almost depleted of oxygen.
Okay.
So if you are able to reconstruct the characteristics of a fire, so the temperature and the oxygen availability, then that might give you clues as to what it was used for. Yeah. And then the other thing you could do is look at the context, because there's other evidence for human behavior around this evidence of fire, hopefully.
Right. Yes.
Bring that in. And then also maybe look for biomolecules in the soil, because they might be related to processing of plants rather than animals. And I worked on on material from a site in France where they had preserved hearths that dated back to the Aurignacian and the Gravettian, so that is 40,000 years ago to, let's say, 25,000 years ago. And then we saw that in certain periods there were more biomolecules related to animal material, and then in other periods, all of a sudden that changed, or all of a sudden it changed
overnight.
10,000s of years. It changed to a signature that was much more dominated by plant material. Now, that you can speculate what this means, but something changed, and that might have to do with the way they used those hearths.
Okay. Which makes sense. I mean, that's sort of like so many things that you have, I guess, or, well, I suppose with us it's sort of different. I'm trying to think of a modern comparison in terms of like what's in the kitchen, like, the oven, but I guess the ovens have changed as well. But, but then I guess if it's like a gas oven or an electric oven or an induction thing, at the stovetop, I mean, then maybe you'd approach things in different ways, or you'd make things in different ways. I don't think I'm making sense.
And as with an oven, which I think is, it is again the application of heat to a specific task. It's used for different things.
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to only put food in it, but it's different types of food. You might bake a cake, and then the next day you might roast a chicken.
Right. Yeah. My daughter has one of those little heat animal things, that you can put, like, usually we put it in the microwave, but technically it says on the label you could put it in the oven at like a very, very, very low temperature, and it will like be nice and warm for her to cuddle. Yeah.
Or I remember as a kid I had these, you could cast like gypsum into a mold, and then that had to somehow be low temperature baked, and then you could like paint those or paint those figurines.
But
true. So the other point I was going to make is no worries, is that like ovens, fire in the past, or a hearth in the past, would have also been used for all of those tasks in sort of the same location for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
So that makes it a bit more difficult.
Right. Yeah.
So really pinpoint one type of behavior.
So it's not like they had a chicken cooking oven and copper working up. Well, I guess they would have had different ovens for copper working, but like a salad cooking oven or something, not salad. Why do you don't cook up salad in an oven? You know what I mean?
You could stir fry some courgette and put it in your salad.
Exactly.
So yeah, in later periods, the younger periods, eventually technology became a bit more specialized. So then you would have cooking ovens and pottery kilns and iron smelting. I guess they're also called kilns. See, this is where I get confused because it's outside of my human evolution. Furnace, that's the word I was looking for. Yes, there we go.
I'm trying to think. It's also probably different in every language, like which ones which.
Which again relates to temperature. But if all you have is a hearth, and even if it's a simple hearth, then you'd use that for all these different applications, and you'd use it for the entire duration of your occupation of a certain area. And maybe when you're on the hunt or when you're foraging, you might quickly start a fire to cook your lunch, which they do have ethnographic evidence for. It's very quick, or modern, I think it's Aboriginals that just like quickly start a fire to light a cigarette and then move on.
Oh, wow.
And so that's maybe something to consider for the archaeological record as well, right? So we tend to focus on sites that have a lot of evidence for occupation, but there might be evidence for human behavior scattered throughout the landscape that we're missing.
Oh, which, I mean, that's the case in so many aspects of archaeology, right? There's so many things out there potentially. I did have one other question related a bit to what we were saying before. So when we were originally talking about it being potentially 1.5 million years ago, and you mentioned that was with Homo erectus, and then, since then there's been quite a few different human species. I can't remember off the top of my head what they all are, but hopefully you can enlighten us. But so do we know that they would have been, or do we imagine that they would have been using it for different purposes as well? Because, for example, when I picture Homo erectus, I remember they were the tool makers, right? They were the first tool makers.
No, but that's originally that's Homo habilis.
Homo habilis.
But then now the first accepted, I guess, maybe not by everyone, tools date back to I think 3 million years ago.
Oh wow! Okay.
So that's like that's way earlier.
Yeah. Which is crazy, like twice as.
And then
far.
it's a bit unclear what species that is actually associated with, because you need, if there's multiple species around at a specific time, you really need human remains associated with the tools to be absolutely sure. Yeah. And even then, it might just have been. It's cause for discussion.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. But anyway, can we see that? Because I think, I don't know, I can imagine it also for many people listening in, maybe you sort of have this assumption of, for example, Homo erectus, and yes, maybe they were using tools, but it was sort of, they're still walking around naked and they're eating raw meat and they're, all of this. It's the classic, stereotype of the kind of caveman, look or whatever. Is that the case, or do we know that they were, for example, using fire to cook?
So because the evidence for Homo erectus is quite contentious, there's not a lot of agreement on even if they used fire, let alone what they would be using fire for. There are, however, a bunch of theories. And the main and most well-known one, it's also been in popular science books, so maybe some of the listeners will recognize this, is linking Homo erectus fire use to cooking food that then would have facilitated the brain growth that we see in that species. Because there's a leap in...
That does sound familiar.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But then you need... So this is sort of a more evolutionary anthropology take on the subject, but then you need the archaeological evidence to support that.
Right.
Which is that's where it gets a bit more difficult.
Right.
But we could think of the earliest fire use as probably related to food, because if you think about other animals using, or let's say making use of fire, there's a bushfire, and then there's certain birds that pick up burning branches and drop them somewhere else so they can chase out prey animals, and
Really?
they become easier to catch. Yeah.
Interesting.
There are reports of other primates going to the location of a natural fire after it's extinguished and foraging basically for toasted nuts and maybe some, this is going to sound a bit harsh, some toasted animals.
Well, I mean, why not? We would.
So if we imagine this happening around the time of Homo erectus, they would have observed maybe that same behavior, but I think the first thing they would have observed is the benefits in terms of food that it gives you. Mm. So that might mean that they would take the fire and then try to cook their food, or maybe they would burn the landscape like these birds, because then they would have access to the toasted nuts and the toasted animals whenever they wanted.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating.
But I mean, all of that is quite hard to prove, especially landscape fire use, which we also have ethnographic evidence for. Yeah. Because of course it looks the same as natural fires.
Yeah.
So you need a really good context to be able to say this is probably man-made landscape fire and not just a natural fire.
You want a little note written being like, Zog made this fire or something. Yeah. Just like, oh yeah, great, cool. This was man-made. This reminds me of, now this might be a bit of a dated theory. It reminds me of a theory that I read about recently where they were talking about Neanderthals specifically and how they were doing almost seasonal fire use, because indeed during the winter months there wasn't as much naturally occurring fire and they weren't as able to produce fire themselves, so it had to use the naturally created stuff. So actually the hearths that they see are only in summer and spring months. Is this still a sort of theory that is rife within the kind of paleo archaeology community, or is that a bit dated now?
It's definitely still promoted by the people who originally suggested it.
Right. Got it.
But it's a massive point of discussion, at least within the people, the group of people that I work with. There's some things that we need to consider for this evidence. So what they found, it's based on 2 sites where they indeed found abundant fire evidence in the warmer layers, so where the climate was a bit nicer, and then much less or even no fire evidence for the layers that relate to a glacial period. However, this might also be an artifact of preservation, because the circumstances in the sedimentation and all of that and the processes in the soil might have varied depending on the climate that the material was deposited in. That's one thing. Then there might be a factor of behavioral choices. Maybe they were, I don't know, starting to fire somewhere else or using them somewhere else, or it could be all sorts of things.
Yeah. Had the scattered throughout the landscape fires that we discussed earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. Or because Neanderthals are also cold adapted, maybe they decided not to use the fire to keep warm, because that is also an assumption, right? That you would need the fire to stay warm in these glacial periods. But what if they were using it for something else? And keeping warm wasn't the main focus of their fire use. Right. And maybe I don't know, there was some sort of task that they did in warmer periods that required the fire, and there was less of a need for that in colder periods. Who knows? The thing about the fire production is that we then have to look for evidence for it, right? So we want to find the tools. And one of my colleagues actually found those tools, and lots of them, associated with Neanderthals at various sites in France dating to 50,000 years ago. So we know that at least some Neanderthals in the same region were regularly producing fire.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And the fun thing about this evidence is that they used hand axes.
Oh,
which I guess was their preferred multi-purpose tool anyway.
Yeah.
Instead of what you'd think about as like a striker-light, where you have like a flake or a blade that you then use to strike it. So the evidence looks different than it looks in more recent periods. which is potentially why it was, up until that paper, quite difficult to trace it back in time. I mean, if you're not looking for the right evidence, you won't find it.
Absolutely, yeah. Which, I mean, could again be the case with so many things, right? In archaeology, it's just that we don't know what it's supposed to look like or what it could look like in the past.
And in terms of fire use, therefore, I think it's super important to keep that chemistry in mind, because if you understand the chemistry, you will have a better understanding of what types of materials are left behind by specific types of fire and how well those different materials might preserve. And then from that, we can start to build hypotheses about the fire use instead of the other way around.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, which leads us nicely to our next section, actually. So we will have a very quick break now so that our listeners can have an opportunity to top up their tea, but we will be back soon. So welcome back, everyone. I hope that the teacups are now full and the biscuit jar emptier. So, Femke, we did already introduce you a bit in the first section and how you got into archaeology, but I thought it might be interesting, especially with all this talk of science and the importance of looking for scientific evidence in archaeological research. We could go into a bit more detail about that aspect and also looking at kind of human evolution and that sort of deep history, shall we say. So, I mean, first of all, if we just go right back to the beginning, I mentioned already that, a lot of people associate archaeology with digging and excavation, but you mentioned that you do a lot of lab work. Did you still start out as the kind of classic field archaeologist student, shall we say, in that respect?
Yeah, I definitely did I got a lot of excavation experience throughout my studies, and I've done some excavations as well after graduating, which is nice to not fully lose touch with the actual context that the materials that I study come from. And I love excavating. I think it's amazing to really have your hands on the context that the materials come from, and to be so close to the past, I guess.
Yeah. And indeed, that's a good point you mentioned in the context. And by context, perhaps you could sort of explain very briefly what you mean by that, in terms of archaeological. So it's sort of the direct association of physical objects, or how would you describe context?
Yeah, I mean that's a good starting point. So to me, context is the combination of the tools and the materials that people in the past have left behind, and the natural environment that it then gets deposited in. So the geological setting, if you will.
Which indeed we were talking, I just realized that we've talked a lot about context in this episode, but it hasn't actually been defined anywhere. So it's probably good to mention it now. Yeah, sorry, everyone. But I think most people by now, if they've listened to this podcast for long enough, they sort of know the general terminology. I can imagine it's very important. Then you've mentioned a couple of examples where it's like, okay, we have this evidence, but if you look at the context, it means this, or we don't have evidence, but if you look at the context, it does mean this. So would you say that it's still very important, even if you're doing lab-based scientific work, to, like you say, keep your hand in with excavation, or do you think that it's not necessary?
I guess technically you don't have to do the excavating yourself if you do this type of research, but I do think it helps, at least to visit those sites, to see where the evidence was found, how it spatially relates to other things, because it does help you not get stuck in the chemistry and relate it to the bigger picture and the rest of the archaeological material.
Yeah, no, definitely. And as you say, the environment's especially in the theme of fire, for example, the environment is such an important aspect as well, it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. And do you think, so you're now kind of more involved in the archaeological science aspect. You mentioned that you always sort of wanted to get more involved with that in the beginning. This is something that I have never felt personally, but that might be because I'm a lab person. So as well. So I never had the feeling that like people who work in the lab are seen as less archaeological, if that makes sense, than people in the field by the rest of the archaeological community. But as someone who had experience with both, have you had that experience? Would you say that there's a little bit of almost a stigma for archaeological scientists or lab work or post-excavation or whatever you want to call it?
Not in my field, I would say, because with human evolution studies, because so little in the grand scheme of things, evidence preserves, applying those techniques to get the most information out, the limited amount of evidence that we have, has always been a thing. And the context is important. The geological context is important. It's important for dating. Those dating techniques are important. The processes that alter the context after things are buried become very important.
Right.
The further back in time you go. So I think for human evolutions, all of those humanities questions and natural sciences techniques in a very broad spectrum have always gone hand in hand. So I don't feel any stigma towards that at all.
I mean, like I said, I've never had it either. It was just, I think I was chatting to some people, or some people were introducing themselves as saying, oh, I'm a lab archaeologist, don't hate me, I know it's not proper archaeology. And I was going, wait, what? Yes, it is. What are you talking about? It's
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important part of making sense of the fieldwork side.
Exactly.
And we wouldn't be able to do the lab work if the fieldwork didn't exist, but we wouldn't be able to interpret the field if we don't have all of those lab techniques.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, very complementary. Indeed, I think that's a nice way to put it. It's you can't have one without the other in a lot of cases, I think.
Exactly.
And you mentioned especially with then kind of in looking at human evolution. So we've already talked a bit about how it's can be different from other regions in terms of it's just so far. I mean, it boggles the mind, really. Like if you try to think about it, it's wow. I don't think I can really grasp exactly. I think I read somewhere it was like Neanderthals had already been around for longer than we have been around so far before we came along, or something like that, which you're like, wait, what? That just doesn't make sense. But what do you find is particularly different about that field of research compared to your experience in other kinds of archaeology?
So I think what characterizes human evolution studies is that we ask really big questions about really big themes in human evolution with very little evidence. I mean, if you compare that to later periods, and this is a discussion that I've had with other archaeology where they were like, well, I don't know how this works. Is this reliable? Are you even able to say anything because you don't have any evidence as compared to, let's say, the Roman period or late prehistory, the Iron Age? There's much more material, which sometimes also makes it a lot more confusing. But so this is me sort of poking to the other side. But if you have a limited amount of evidence, you have to get really creative with how you tackle that. And I think this is why most of the application of natural sciences techniques start out in my field and then sort of gradually work their way into other sides of archaeology.
Yeah, because indeed it's sort of they can really make a difference. I mean, they can make a difference everywhere, but they can really make a difference in looking at human evolution.
Yeah, but also, like you said, those time spans they're difficult to comprehend. It's millions of years. I mean, we get comfortable with it because that's all we do.
Yeah,
but you also have to realize that then the margin of error and the resolution you have it's not great, or at least it's very different compared to later periods.
Yeah.
So there are certain questions you won't be able to answer because you simply do not have the resolution for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of, it could be, be this, but it could not be.
Like we don't even know if certain hearths are contemporaneous to the tools that we find in the same layer.
Right.
Because those layers might be tens of thousands of years.
Yeah. Which
makes hearths a very interesting snapshot because they might have been used for a long period of time, but not thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, well, although you never know, maybe there is the ultimate oven that, is just perfect and people just kept using it for thousands of years.
They are still using it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you never know. And I can imagine that also makes it even more difficult. I mean, I find it bad enough, and I do sort of, prehistory, kind of late-ish prehistory, I suppose, is that whole idea that, yes, they were still people, but at the same time, they lived in a completely different world than we do now, both kind of culturally and environmentally and all this kind of stuff. And so you have to, remove yourself a little bit, and any interpretations you make, you have to try and remove your modern bias, so to speak. And that's just looking at late prehistory humans, like Homo sapiens. But I can imagine if you're looking at other species of human and things like that, is it more difficult to sort of feel that connection? Do you feel like you're more, how to say, more removed, kind of emotionally, shall we say, from the people you're looking at? Or would you say that's still an important factor, if that makes sense?
That's a very good point. So personally, I feel very connected to the hominins we study, because I love them and I love learning about them. And I think it's so cool that we can go so far back in time and really trace our origins. That being said, they're not us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't know if things worked the same way. Those are all assumptions.
Yeah.
But you also have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So you have to keep this in mind, but not let it limit your ability to study the past too much, because otherwise we just won't get anywhere.
Which is also just a problem in archaeology in general, right? That whole thing of I remember chatting to someone and they sort of said, what do you love most about archaeology? And I said, what I actually love most is that we can never really know, what exactly happened. They were going, but like, how can you get any satisfaction then? Because surely if you can never know, then you never get that sort of sense of release, of being sure about something. And I mean, that's, again, just for late prehistory. But again, for human evolution and that kind of, Pleistocene archaeology, I guess, it's even more the case.
So my trick to balance it out
to avoid completely mentally spiraling and going, what does it all matter?
And people might be able to guess this, is focusing on the natural processes.
There you go.
Because those are universal and you can measure them and you can understand them. And then from there, you can try and approach the archaeology, and indeed we'll never be sure, but we can get close, maybe.
We could say maybe things that might potentially, or perhaps.
I mean, and science in general is aimed at finding the best explanation for something with the available evidence, and then changing those explanations if new evidence comes available. So that's no different for archaeology. The only problem we have is that we cannot go back to check if it's actually true, or ask anyone.
Which is such a shame. It would be so useful to just know.
If time travel was real, that would be great. But then we might also all lose our jobs.
Exactly. I mean, archaeology would be a bit obsolete then, because everyone.
We don't want that either.
No, exactly. Well, I think we can be safe in the knowledge that probably time travel will never be invented, because surely we would have met someone by now.
That's the time travel paradox,
right? You would think it was that's the whole thing, no? That, if ever anyone invents time travel, come back to this moment and say something, and then okay, cool, that's fine. But I did have one kind of sort of final question on this topic, because indeed it's sort of a very specialized area that you're in now. It's human evolution, but it's looking at fire in human evolution, and it's looking at the chemical processes of fire in human evolution. What would you say are kind of the advantages and the disadvantages of such a specialization? Like, for example, do you think that you are now very much in that niche? Do you think that you could also then change to Roman archaeology tomorrow if you needed to? What's the kind of range of specialization that you get to at this stage?
I think it's helpful to have a specialization, because it gives you something to really sink your teeth in and to focus on, and to build your academic profile around. People will also know if we have questions about this topic, we go to this person.
That's why you're here today as well.
Or some other people who are specializing in the same thing. That being said, if you choose something that is very niche and that not a lot of other people do, then you run the risk of your colleagues not knowing where to put you, which is a problem I run into, because not a lot of people approach fire from a chemical perspective. So I'm really trying to promote this way of thinking and get more people to do it. But I mean, I guess most specializations probably started out like that. So there's a lot of research going on about fire, but people tend to take different approaches. Then for what I do, because I study fundamental processes, so just natural things that they always work fundamentally in the same way. Fire is always a fire that follows certain rules. And so the other aspect of my research is preservation. There are certain rules that processes in the soil follow as well. So if you understand those processes, that those data and techniques can then be applied to any other period. So I could indeed decide tomorrow that I want to research Roman fires, and then all of my stuff can just be transferred. I don't want to do that, but I could give my data and tools to other people who would then be able to do that. And I think that's the strength of fundamental research.
And you mentioned a little bit of, that indeed not many people now are doing chemical analysis of fire, or however you would like to say it. But because I can imagine that a lot of people might think that, but someone's already doing that, or that's a very niche topic. Say there's a archaeology student listening in going, I'd love to do fire in human evolution, but Femke's already doing that, so that's already being done. Do you think that's a valid supposition, or would you sort of encourage people, even if other people are already doing it, to do the same topic, do something slightly different? What would your kind of advice be to that potential archaeology student? If
you're excited about a topic, go for it. And then you'll find the thing, the question, the technique, the combination of those things that hasn't been done yet and that you can focus on. I also think there's a certain threshold. If the specialization is extremely niche, there might be 5 people doing it, and then it does feel a little bit like, but they're already doing it. Why should I go in the same direction? If the specialization is a bit broader and there's lots of people are doing it in lots of different countries, then that also, I think, makes you feel that there's more space for everyone, because there's also so much archaeology that we cannot possibly have one person do all of it. So it's helpful if we have more of the same specialists, that we can divide the workload and also find different questions to answer, because everyone has their own, I think, perspective on the past and preferences and different methods. So
especially because you were talking about imagination being so vital, so I can imagine that also would be very beneficial.
Yeah, exactly. Developing techniques, coming up with different questions, building on existing work.
Those of you listening in who want to do this, but with feeling, no, people are already doing it, that's fine. Just have your own take on it.
And what I would also like to add is, don't be afraid of the chemistry. If you're interested in it, I had no background in chemistry. I took it for a little bit in high school. Then I dropped it, ironically. Should not have done that. But then I just decided this is what I want to do. I'll work towards understanding the parts that I need to be able to do this. And it takes some extra work. And sometimes I run into problems in data and I'm like, is this very complex, or am I just missing some of the basics that would have made this an easy solution? But you can always work through that. There's literature, there's other specialists that you can talk to. So if you want to do something, just go for it.
No, I think that's a very nice thing to potentially end the podcast on. Although I did also want to ask, because I understand you're continuing your research into fire with a postdoc, are there any hints that you have on sort of exciting discoveries or research questions that you're going to be discussing or researching further?
So my PhD work focused a lot on method development. So I was in the lab a lot working with modern materials. So I'm very excited to start and applying that knowledge and those data and techniques to more archaeology, and also to explore other methods and other proxies to answer other questions about fire. So I'd like to explore landscape fire use and see if we can use biomarkers, so molecules in sediments, to get some extra information about this very difficult to trace behavior. So there's lots of exciting ideas on the horizon, and then now I need to figure out which ones I'm going to do and where and how. Yes, it's exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. Well, good luck with all of those things. that marks the end of our tea break. It sounds like you've got a lot to do, so I should let you get back to it. But thank you so much for joining me today, Femke. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And yeah, thank you very much. And if anyone wants to find out more about Femke's work or research into fire or anything that we've chatted about today, do check the show notes on the podcast homepage. I will be putting up some links there. So yes, I hope that everyone enjoyed our journey today. It varied a lot. I think this is the deepest we've ever gone back in time.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry.
No, it was good. It was great. So yeah, enjoy and see you next month for another episode of Tea Break Time Travel. I hope that you enjoyed our journey today. If you did, make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And I'll see you next month for another episode of Tea Break Time Travel.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.